Krimpacki, and I am the Publications Manager at the Walter H. Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford University. Today, I'm happy to be speaking with Ambassador Scot Marciel, who has 35 years of experience working as a career diplomat, including serving as the first U.S. Ambassador for ASEAN Affairs, the ambassador to Indonesia, and the ambassador to Myanmar, his last post before retirement. Now he is the Oxenberg-Rollin Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford University, and he's here to talk with me about his upcoming book, Imperfect Partners, the United States and Southeast Asia, which is published jointly by Shorenstein APARC and Rowman and Littlefield. Ambassador Marciel, thanks for taking the time out to talk to me.
Thanks, George. I'm looking forward to this.
Your book focuses on the last 35 years of events in Southeast Asia, examining most closely those regions that you were intensely involved in as a foreign service officer and diplomat, the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Myanmar, as well as looking at the role of ASEAN and U.S. involvement with that organization. I thought we could start by looking at a couple of recent news stories, the first of which is the deal announced that will be giving the United States access to 4 additional bases of operations in the Philippines. Your first Southeast Asian overseas assignment was, I believe, in 1985 at the U.S. Embassy in Manila, where you were witness to historic change in the Philippines. And the second chapter in your book about the U.S.-Philippine relationship since the People Power Revolution is titled A Bumpy Ride. So seeing the reporting on this new deal gave me a little bit of, I guess, deja vu. Do you think this will be a new chapter in relations between the two countries? Or is this just another cycle of inevitable up and down depending on the leadership in Manila and Washington, and due in part to our, I guess, colonial legacy in the area? The other part of the question is, were you surprised at President Ferdinand Marcos Jr.'s decision to allow this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think it is a new chapter, but whether it's a durable chapter, maybe in the relationship, I think remains to be seen. As I wrote in the book, over the last, really since the fall of Ferdinand Marcos Sr., the relationship between the two countries has really been up and down, depending on a lot of factors, including who is sitting in Malacañang Palace running the Philippines. But I think what we've seen at the beginning of the Ferdinand Marcos Jr. administration is, in a way, a continuation, at least in foreign policy terms, of what we saw before President Duterte, but in some ways also a continuation even of the last year of the Duterte administration, where after a pretty intense flirtation with China, I think there was a recognition that that relationship wasn't delivering as much as they had hoped, and that having a good security relationship and good overall relationship with the United States was still really important. I'm a little bit surprised with the speed at which President Bongbong Marcos has moved to shore up the alliance, but I think it fits with what we're seeing overall from him. He also went to Beijing, which made sense, trying to keep that relationship strong. He's going in the coming days to Japan, which is also another important relationship. So he's off to, I think, a quite strong start in foreign policy terms.
Can you anticipate any possible pitfalls in how this is going to go? I mean, it's always gets a little complicated when you have a bunch of U.S. service members in another country, and there is some, I guess, definite resentment by parts of Philippine society. And of course, these aren't U.S. bases. We have to be clear about that. Right. That is prohibited by, I guess, is it an amendment to the Philippine Constitution, maybe?
Yeah, it's in the Constitution. That's right.
So what could go wrong with this?
Yeah, I mean, there's always, risks. I think the risks with an agreement like the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA, are much smaller than they are with the permanent bases that we had, or not permanent, the long-term bases, U.S. bases that we had when I was first there. And that was really a legacy of maybe the colonial period and certainly the Cold War period. And a significant segment of Philippine society didn't want, long-term, U.S. bases, as opposed to something like EDCA, which are Philippine bases, in which the Philippine government allows the U.S. to store some equipment there, rotate troops through there, but also commits the U.S. to investing in those bases, making them more effective bases for the Philippines. So I think this is a more modern and more equal partnership, and I think that reduces the risks greatly. Yeah, you always worry that, a bit of any kind of bad behavior by even an individual serviceman could and likely would cause some upset. But I think overall, this is in some ways, a healthier alliance relationship, certainly a healthier basis relationship than what we had in the old days.
The other story that caught my eye was in the New York Times. It was titled "China and the U.S. are wooing Indonesia and Beijing has the edge," which itself says a lot. You note in your book that when you arrived in 2010 to serve as ambassador to Indonesia, there was a lot of optimism. But since then, that has declined, particularly in reference to the economy, to the state of democracy, and democratic institutions, and relations with the United States. In this article, an Indonesian minister was quoted about dealing with the Chinese, and he said, quote, "They never ever dictate." And the article continues, he said that American officials often come with a list of onerous conditions before an investment can be approved. And the minister said that he told Washington, "The way you deal with us, forget it." Can you talk about how relations between the two countries have been evolving in the last decade since you were there? And explain a little bit about these kind of onerous conditions that the United States requires before investing in countries like Indonesia, and why they make sense.
Yeah, first a comment on that article, which I had read in the New York Times. It was a good article, but I took some issue with how it was framed, in which the U.S. and China were competing for the, quote, prize of Indonesia. And the first point is, Indonesia is not a prize to be won. It's a obviously very proud, independent country and is not going to be won by anybody. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, and also to avoid the temptation, which we all fall into sometimes, of scoring diplomatic relations like a sporting event. Who's ahead, who's going to win? That's not really, I think, a very helpful way to look at these things. Countries in Southeast Asia in general, including Indonesia, will want to have good relations with the United States and with China. They may lean one way or the other at times, but that's natural. In terms of the, first Indonesia, I still think of Indonesia overall as a big success story. When you look at the transition from the Suharto era at the end of the 90s to democracy, it was really tumultuous. And there were concerns in the late 90s, early 2000s that Indonesia might even go the way of Yugoslavia. So I think it's emerged as a pretty strong democracy with a very powerful, influential civil society. Does it have flaws in its democracies? Yes, but it's hard to find democracies that don't have flaws. In terms of the relationship, I think, again, Indonesia, the non-aligned movement attitude and mentality is pretty deeply embedded, I think, in the Indonesian psyche. So they're not going to align with the United States or I think with China or anyone else. And they're going to resent pressure from any other major power. That's just the way in their constitution, so to speak, not literally. In terms of what Minister Luhut Panjaitan was saying in that article, again, I don't want to speak for him. I know him pretty well, and he's a very influential figure. I think the way I would put it is Indonesia, certainly under President Joko Widodo, Jokowi, has been very anxious to attract foreign investment in infrastructure in particular as a way of keeping the economy growing at a rapid pace. Makes sense. China, particularly through the Belt and Road Initiative, offers sort of fairly quick, at least on paper, and not necessarily unconditional, but packages, investments with financing with very few conditions. So it's attractive. The downside of it is you can't always count on the investments to happen. And sometimes there are problems with those investments, the quality of them, sometimes disregard for social and environmental consequences. I think the U.S. has tried to come in with alternatives. And when Minister Panjaitan was talking about U.S. investment, I assume he was meaning U.S. government investment, because the private sector invests as it wishes. It doesn't, there's no requirements from the U.S. government to impose conditions. So I think the U.S. has tried to go for better quality, more durable, more reliable investment in infrastructure, which is a good idea. I think, though, sometimes as a result, we aim a little too high in terms of the standards, in my personal opinion. And we can make it sometimes those investments less attractive for the host governments. So I think right to aim for the quality investment and sort of pay attention to things like environmental factors, how labor is treated, that sort of thing. But if you make those conditions too onerous, you will make your investments less attractive.
I appreciate your warning note. We certainly don't want to look at these countries as pawns on a board that we want to manipulate. I guess the flip side of that, though, is that they're aware, to use the metaphor from the headline, that we're courting them, and that the United States is concerned about the South China Sea, and we're concerned about China wielding its influence. So I guess it's part of the game.
The United States is courting them, China is courting them, and that's all fine. And to a certain extent, these countries can and do use it to their advantage, right? If they have two major powers wooing them, as long as they're not exerting heavy pressure on them, that can be actually a positive thing for these countries. I think, to me, the key is too often in the United States, and maybe this is true in Beijing too, I don't know, we worry excessively about what China is doing and look at Southeast Asia too often through the prism of our relationship with China and who has more influence. And so we'll go to Southeast Asia, Indonesia, or elsewhere and talk about China. These governments, these countries are fully aware of the pros and cons of working with China and the pros and cons of working with us. We don't need to teach them this. What we should be focused on is not so much what China's doing, but what we're doing. Are we being a good partner? What are we doing with Indonesia and other countries that makes us an attractive partner? Security, economic benefits, working together on health. And we are doing a lot. But I think the more we can look at the prism of, we're looking at you, Indonesia, or others, because we want to have a good relationship with you, and less we're looking at you because we're worried about China. That's really the mentality I think we have to have.
You refer to the Chinese approach as pragmatic diplomacy, like you talked about in Myanmar, where they were able to immediately pivot from non-support of Aung San Suu Kyi to, we were there all along and we can work together. It seems, in some respect, it's hard to compete with that.
Yes and no. I mean, I think China is pragmatic and sort of opportunistic at the same time. As you said, they switched from supporting the military dictatorship in Myanmar to supporting and having a good relationship with the Aung San Suu Kyi government. And then after the coup, now they're working with the coup government. Now, the risks for China in that is that they've alienated pretty much 90% of the Myanmar population by supporting the coup government. So does that come back to haunt them? I don't know. What they're also doing with some of their deals is furthering or exacerbating some existing problems of corruption, environmental damage, and so on, which alienates communities. Maybe it pays off for them, maybe it doesn't. But the United States, even if we wanted to take that route, that's not realistic for us given the domestic politics and what we stand for. So again, I think we do well by worrying a little bit less about what China's doing and focusing instead about what we're doing, and focusing on Southeast Asia for its own merits, because this is it's a large, economically very significant, politically very significant part of the world that merits our attention, even if China didn't exist.
Since we started talking about Myanmar, let's talk about it. It was your last post with the State Department as ambassador that ended in 2020. And we just passed the 2-year anniversary of the 2021 coup. Reported estimates are grim. According to some, over 1 million civilians have been displaced, over 17,000 arrested, and close to 3,000 killed during that period. The account of your time in Myanmar is probably the most disheartening chapter in the book. Mm-hmm. You raise questions about the limits of what sanctions can achieve and the problem of engagement when one side's not interested. Is there an end in sight for this coup and for the country's turmoil?
It's a really good question. When I left Myanmar in 2020, I got there in 2016, just a week before the Aung San Suu Kyi government took office, and it was probably the height of euphoria in Myanmar and probably in the United States as well about Myanmar. And you had during that period, of course, the horrific Rohingya crisis, which saw the Myanmar military drive several 100,000 members of the Rohingya community out of the country in a very violent, bloody operation, and that saw a significant percentage of the Myanmar population either believe reports that this wasn't happening, or even worse, seeming to be okay with it. So that was, a really troubling period. Despite that, and it's hard to say despite something that we call a genocide, because how can anything be despite a genocide? But if you keep that in mind, and the huge impact that it had, not only certainly on the Rohingya population, but also on the country as a whole, I think it's still fair to say that in 2020, most people, not all, most people in Myanmar had more freedom, higher incomes, and better opportunity than they'd had a decade before. That's not to say, therefore, never mind what happened to the Rohingya. I don't mean it in that respect. But there was a sense of hope and opportunity despite deep disappointment in some areas. The military coup basically eliminated that hope and opportunity. Because Myanmar people know, they've lived under military rule for decades. They know what it's like. It's horrific, not only from a human rights point of view, but also because the military mismanages the economy, doesn't invest in education, healthcare. They do basically everything wrong. So this is why you've seen really this national uprising against the military. It's called a revolution. And people engaged in a pretty significant resistance effort against the military that's putting enormous pressure on it. We don't see an end in sight anytime soon. I think there is momentum behind the resistance, but the military has the advantage of a lot of guns and not caring how many people of its own people it kills to stay in power. So it's a really tragic time for the people of Myanmar. And also there's no hope for the Rohingya community as long as the military is in power. The one, I don't even want to call it a silver lining because there's nothing positive, but the one positive development we've seen since the coup is more and more Myanmar people, especially from the majority Bamar community, explicitly recognizing the legitimate grievances and the suffering of many of the ethnic minority populations, including the Rohingya, over the past years, and some recognition that they were fed a lot of propaganda for a long time about what was really happening. And so there's a long way to go, but there's at least the beginnings of a movement toward more sympathy, more sensitivity, and the need to change attitudes and the way the country's even governed so that all of these communities are included and feel included in a future Myanmar.
How did the so-called Burma Lobby make your job harder or easier? And in general, how do human rights groups help or hamper the efforts of U.S. diplomats who, in many cases, I can only think that they're working to affect the same kind of change that these groups are demanding?
Yeah, they help more often than they hurt. But there's sometimes disagreements on tactics. I mean, I certainly, when I was overseas, particularly as ambassador, engaged regularly with the human rights groups and found it very useful. I tend to be extremely knowledgeable, have a lot of information often that I don't have, as well as really keen insights. And they also serve a very useful role. I mean, I don't mean to suggest they exist to serve the U.S. government, but they play an important role by making sure that we don't get so caught up in strategic interests or other things that we lose sight of the really important issues of human rights on a day-to-day basis. So I always found it really valuable to engage with them. I think the one area of tactical disagreement sometimes, this is for me personally, was that there was a tendency in the human rights community, but also sometimes in official Washington, to feel or to believe that the only type of action that made sense when you're dealing with a difficult situation was a public statement or imposition of sanctions. And so there was, why haven't you issued a public statement on this? Well, public statements are important, but they're not the only tool. And sometimes they can be counterproductive in the short term. Sanctions can be really useful, but in my view, their value is overstated. It's hard to use sanctions alone to engineer a change in behavior. I'm not saying they don't have any value, but it's sort of the easy tool to pick up and wield. And so we tend to rely on statements and sanctions. So I think there's tactical differences. But overall, I think having strong human rights organizations is an asset.
One thing I'd definitely like to ask you about is your experience in Vietnam. In some ways, it seems against all odds that relatively quickly, in the big scheme of things, we were able to reestablish diplomatic relations with Vietnam. And before we were speaking about human rights lobbies, I mean, I can't think of a more powerful lobby really than the POW MIA lobby. They were very active. And yet we're able to get this job done. Can you talk about it a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it is fascinating, the relationship. I went to Vietnam in 1993 to open up the first State Department office since the war, which a couple of years later turned into establishment of full diplomatic relations and the opening of the embassy. But really, when I look at the U.S.-Vietnam relationship, which was, obviously as low as you could get in 1975 at the end of the war, hostile. We just fought a horrific war. Then they became a Soviet Union client state. So, there was a horrible situation of the boat people, refugees, hundreds of thousands of people who fled Vietnam in dire circumstances. But over time, pragmatism on both sides prevailed. The Vietnamese leadership deciding for their own reasons that they needed to chart a different path, partly because the Soviet Union was collapsing and they could no longer rely on that, but also because they knew they needed to improve their economy. And so they became more willing to work with us on some things that we cared about, like primarily accounting for our unaccounted for servicemen from the war, but also allowing people who wanted to leave Vietnam from re-education camps to flee, agreeing over time to withdraw from Cambodia. And the U.S., for its part, was willing to be reasonably patient and offer what we called a roadmap toward normalization that included better cooperation on POW MIA accounting. And there was sufficient progress over time to build that, to allow us to normalize. And then the momentum just continued as we kept working to address each other's concerns. The commercial relationship really began taking off in the late 90s, early 2000s, and has continued to really thrive. The human rights concerns of the United States has been a consistent issue throughout, and something that's been an irritant and that we raise regularly and have always raised with the Vietnamese. But both sides have agreed to talk about that issue, but not let it define the relationship or limit the relationship excessively. And so I think it's some ways you can never replicate relationships, but it's an example of how, despite some differences, two countries and a really fraught history, two countries, that approach things pragmatically and are willing to work and work together, can really make a lot of progress. So I think it's a really good news story.
I wanted to ask you how the job of U.S. Foreign Service Officer has changed in the era of social media. I guess one example I'm thinking specifically of is the YouTube video, The Innocence of Muslims, that came out while you were ambassador to Indonesia, and I can imagine created some headaches for you and for your staff, but also, just social media in general.
Yeah, well, it's been a huge factor, certainly. I mean, in sort of operational terms, it means that, the old days of directing people to your embassy website or issuing press statements or press releases on things has kind of gone by the wayside. And it is important to be very active on social media to reach the audience. So that's just created a huge demand for material, but also to use it wisely. And I think the State Department has done an okay job, but we still are sort of staffed for the old days when you did a once a week press conference or a press release. So I think we could use more resources in that area. Second, as you suggested, George, it's meant a lot more access to information for people around the world, but also platforms for people to use, often for good, sometimes not for good. The issue or the case of the production of this movie, this film, The Innocence of Muslims, out of some individual or group, I think in California, that at least came out in, I believe, 2011, and really an insulting film, offended Muslims around the world and caused a sometimes violent reaction in many countries, a pretty strong reaction as well in Indonesia. It was hard to explain to people even though the United States government had nothing to do with this video and even condemned it, many people didn't understand why we didn't ban it, we didn't prevent it from being on social media. And so we got into those sort of theoretical discussions about freedom of speech and how in the US you can't really say no to this, which people might intellectually accept, but it was hard emotionally, I think, for a lot of people to accept. Like, you're going to allow this. And so it was, it was very troubling. And differently, but also very significant. In Myanmar, you had, not really related to the United States, but you had before and during the time of the Rohingya crisis, you had these hardline nationalist Buddhist individuals and groups who were preaching hate toward the Rohingya and toward Muslims in general on Facebook. And millions of people in Myanmar are on Facebook. It was at that time the main access to the internet people had, and for many, the main source of news. So, it definitely has created big problems in that sense that, people in these countries, as well as in the United States, a lot of people don't double check or filter what they see and hear on social media. And so it leads to a lot of people buying just factually incorrect information and reacting to it. So it's difficult for governments, and certainly it's difficult in terms of foreign policy.
Several times in your book, you talk about the value of retail diplomacy, I think you call it.
Yeah.
And also soft programs. You also talk about appealing to the youth in the various countries where you've been in order to help them get to a place where they can affect change in their own country. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of this?
I mean, we've had so-called public diplomacy programs for decades, and it's a wide range. And, in the old days, it was U.S. Information Agency libraries where people could come in and read Life magazine to learn about life in the United States, or maybe to study English. These days, it's much different, of course, because people can access that much more easily in other ways now. But basically, it's telling the story of the United States, what the United States is doing, but also talking about broader issues like democracy, what does freedom of speech mean, these sorts of things. And it's important to do it in a way that's not throwing out propaganda, because then we're no better than some other governments that just do nothing but propaganda. So it's got to be honest. It's got to include, here's some of the things we're struggling with. I think certainly in Indonesia, Myanmar, there is a lot of interest in the United States. A lot of people still look up to the United States. And there's some demand for, what's going on? Why do you do things this way? And I think getting out and reaching people as much as you can. Obviously, you can't reach everybody in these large countries, but getting out and going and visiting schools, talking to people, having visitors from the United States who might be academics or athletes or anything, going around, it allows people to get a real sense of, so these are what Americans are like, or this is how America is. And I think that's hugely important. A big aspect of it is encouraging people to come and facilitating people coming to study in the United States. Because, as we see at Stanford, people who come study in the United States, A, get a good education, and then can go back and contribute in their countries. But B, more times than not, they come away as lifetime friends of the United States. And, you need all the friends that you can get. And they're still loyal to their country, of course, but they have an understanding of the United States that can help explain it to others. And they tend to have a generally positive view of the United States. So more programs to give people that exposure are enormously helpful, and also to encourage discussion, for example, about democracy and human rights. I don't think we should be saying, this is what you should do. I don't think that's productive, certainly in this day and age. But raising this question, so here's how we're working with this issue in the United States. Here's how we're dealing with our race problems, the good and the bad, for example. Being very honest, I think, kind of often serves as a catalyst for people in their own country to talk about their similar issues or their particular issues in a way that's helpful. So it's not US imposed, but we're sort of contributing or helping to start a conversation.
What's the one thing that you think the United States government can do differently or do better to improve its status in and relationships with the countries of Southeast Asia?
It's hard to narrow it down to one. In brief, it's to show up and engage consistently with humility and with a focus on the countries that we're talking to, as I said earlier, not on China. So, because what they're looking for the most part is, can we count on the US being a long-term partner? If they can, it allows them more freedom of maneuver. It doesn't mean that they're going to be on our side, but it gives them more freedom of maneuver. If they're not sure they can count on us, then frankly, they have less freedom of maneuver, particularly vis-a-vis China. And it's harder for them to make decisions that China might not like. So again, it's not all about China, but it's really about ensuring freedom of maneuver by being a good partner. If I could add a second thing, it's bolster our economic policy, particularly trade. That has been, even though we're a major economic player in Southeast Asia, the absence of a strong trade initiative since we pulled out of TPP definitely hurts our influence.
It seems that often the State Department is at the mercy of changing administrations in its effort to consistently show up and be a reliable partner. What can we do about that?
Yeah, there's no easy answer. I mean, as much as possible, it's, explaining to incoming administrations why a modest investment of time and energy pays big dividends. Sometimes that will work. It depends on the incoming administration and particularly the incoming president, but failing to show up at the presidential level and at other senior levels, particularly if we fail to show up over 2 or 3 or 4 years, like what happened in the Trump administration, you pay a high price. You've undone all the good that you had done in previous years by investing in those relationships. It doesn't mean people turn against America. It's more, it lowers their sense of confidence in us as a partner.
On that note, I want to thank you very much for your time, Ambassador Marciel, and best of luck with your book. I found it to be a very fascinating read. If you don't know a lot about Southeast Asia, it'll give you some background. It'll give your amazing stories. It seems like many times you were always in the right place at the right time. You're kind of like the Forrest Gump of the State Department. And it also, gives your thoughts on how to make things work a little better going forward.
Thanks, George. I do appreciate it. And yes, there was definitely a Forrest Gump element to my really good luck of being in a lot of fascinating places at fascinating times. I think it's reflected in the book.